Everyone, my name is Aomar Boum. I'm professor of anthropology, history, and Near Eastern languages and cultures here at UCLA, and the Maurice Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies. I would like to welcome you to UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies event today, which today features Dr. Papamichos Chronakis talk on Seeing Like a Merchant, Jews and Greeks from Ottoman to Greek Rule, 1876-1919. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like, please take a moment to silence your phones. I would like also to mention that the books will be available for purchase after the event. Dr. Paris, and also by the way, the event is co-sponsored with UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. Dr. Papamichos Chronakis is lecturer in modern Greek history at Royal Holloway University of London. As a scholar of economic history, urban history, and social history, his teaching and research centers on the history and memory of the modern Mediterranean. Dr. Chronakis explores questions of transition from empire to nation state, bringing together the interrelated histories of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian urban middle classes from the late Ottoman Empire to the Holocaust. His research and publications include, among some subjects, post-imperial urban identities, Balkan War, refugees, Zionism and anti-Zionism in interwar Europe, the Holocaust of Sephardic Jewry, and digital Holocaust studies. Dr. Chronakis is also involved in a digital history project to map and visualize the social networks of Jewish deportees in Nazi concentration camps, and serves on the editorial board of the Bulletin de Correspondance Hellénique Moderne et Contemporain. His first book, The Business of Transition, Jewish and Greek Merchants of Salonica from Ottoman to Greek Rule, was published by Stanford University Press in 2024, winning that year's National Year's Book Award, GDC Herbert Catrix Award, writing based on archival material. One might think that so much has already been written about Salonica that earlier scholars left little for later historians to add. And we have some of the scholars here in attendance. The business of transition proves otherwise. Rather than centering his argument on state policies, ethno-nationalist ideology, or fixed identities, Dr. Chronakis narrates Salonica's transition from Ottoman, maybe called Ottoman millet, to Greek rule history through the history of commerce and merchants. His analysis treats minoritization, this is the key term, I guess, and at least from my research, I would say I share with the scholar and as far as the book, as a shifting, relational, and negotiated process, which allows him to move beyond older binary accounts of ethnic conflict and fixed identities. He also departs from interpretive frameworks that cast minorities as passive actors, instead foregrounding their agency and compelling readers to think more carefully about what it means to transit into minority or majority state. I guess that's what Dr. Chronakis will be talking to us about today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chronakis.
I'd like to start by thanking the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies and its director, William Schiedenwind, for generously inviting me to discuss my work with you. I would also like to thank the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the study of Hellenic culture and its director, Sharon Gerstel, for co-sponsoring this event. I'm particularly indebted to Aomar Boum, the Amado Chair in Sephardic Studies and a good friend, as well as to the Maurice Amado program in Sephardic Studies for hosting me as part of their event series. Me, a little shrimp among some very, very big fish. And then there is Chelsea White, the program coordinator, who made it all possible, and always with a smile. I am blessed to see dear friends in the audience today, people who have supported me and the book while filling my life with joy ever since my graduate days. Reading is a solitary activity, but books bring people together. For that, a heartfelt thank you. The words that follow are as much yours as they are mine. I start with a quote. Salonica is not a city of letters, nor an industrial city. It is a city of commerce, not primarily commercial, but solely commercial. Every blow against commerce is a blow against the whole of Salonica, declared the Greek newspaper Tophos in 1915. By then, the city has been Greek for just about 3 years, after nearly 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. It had been Byzantine for even longer, second only to Constantinople, and before that, Roman and Hellenistic. Established in 315 BCE, Salonica had seen many empires come and just as many go. It had also seen its population change time and again, eventually becoming one of the world's most diverse cities by the early 20th century. When the Greek troops entered on October 26, 1912, Salonica was home to circa 150,000 people, whose origins spanned the Mediterranean and traversed the Balkans. Approximately 70,000 were Sephardi Jews, a near majority ever since they had settled in the city following their expulsion from Spain in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Muslim Turks and Donme, that is Jewish converts to Islam, barely reached 30,000, whereas Greek Orthodox Christians trailed far behind at no more than 10,000. Additionally, there were some 6,000 Bulgarians, alongside Romanians, Albanians, and a few Armenians and Kurds. Small European colonies of French, Italians, Germans, and Austro-Hungarians added to the mix. There was a reason Salonica was commonly known as the Babel of the Mediterranean. Commerce was the common thread binding it all together. In 1933, Georgios Christodoulou, a local Greek journalist, titled his history of the city, Salonica, City of Commerce. The work, probably the first local economic history, traced Salonica's long past through the lens of trade. Christodoulou memorialized merchants as the city's main historical actors. While emphasizing the role of the Greeks, he did not fail to acknowledge the significant contributions of the Jews. Published 4 years into the global financial crisis that had finally reached Salonica, in a time marked by economic distress, political instability, rising anti-Semitism, and unprecedented Christian-Jewish friction, his book offered Salonica a usable past fit for all. Christodoulou was looking back in search of a brighter future. Commerce, it seemed, held the key to understanding the city's changing fortunes. In 1914, right after the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, and just before the outbreak of World War I, a Jewish Salonican intellectual, Joseph Nehama, published in Paris La Ville Convoitée, Salonica, the coveted city, Salonica, the first and for a long time the only truly integrated history of the city. Nehama celebrated Salonica's grandeur, but also identified a tension between the city's enduring importance and its perennially contested territorial status. How was it, he asked, that Salonica thrived amid brutal conquests? Nehama argued that Salonica's appeal to both past empires and modern nationalisms stemmed from its role as a crucial commercial hub, strategically located at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with the Balkans and the Adriatic with the Aegean Sea. While Salonika may never have been an empire's capital, it made empires great. Commerce was not just part or a part of Salonika's story. It was the city's destiny. The coveted city appeared at a time of wars, which were beginning to tear Salonika's multi-ethnic fabric apart. Between 1913 and 1918, the city was spared no conflict. The Second Balkan War in the summer of 1913 saw the Greeks expelling most of its Bulgarian population. By the summer of 1914, Greek Orthodox refugees were disembarking at the port, having fled Ottoman persecution in Asia Minor. The outbreak of World War I further complicated matters as Jews and Greeks, the city's two major communities, were both torn apart between supporters of the Entente and the Central Powers. Salonika was drifting apart. In these turbulent times, Nehama sought to create a unifying narrative by introducing a character of broad appeal, the Salonican merchant. In a memorable passage, he portrayed this figure as the driving force behind Salonika's unprecedented development since the 1870s. I quote, "The Salonican becomes bolder. He develops a taste for risk. He hardly needs any initial capital. A directory and a ream of letterhead paper are more than sufficient for him," unquote. Nehama extolled the merchant's business savvy and made him a model for all to emulate. The merchant was the epitome of the true Salonican, embodying a spirit of unity amid the city's diverse and challenging landscape. Commerce was the sole positive, inclusive identity that Salonika could embrace. It was more than just a trade. Merchants were integral to the city's psyche and were mythologized accordingly. Despite this, their legacy was only faintly preserved thereafter, mainly in the names of those imposing villas they built in the upscale Campanias quarter east of the walled city, names like Villa Modiano, Morpurgo, Hadjilazaru, and Alatini. After 1991, with the collapse of socialism in the Balkans and the opening of regional borders, Salonika's elite fostered high hopes of commercial revival. Concomitantly, a nostalgic, progressive discourse quickly emerged, celebrating the city's lost cosmopolitan past by reminiscing on its multi-ethnic commercial bourgeoisie, thereby mythologizing it anew. Yannis Boutaris, the former mayor of Salonika, best captured this sentiment in 2010, when he lamented that the city's current predicament stemmed from the absence of a dynamic entrepreneurial bourgeoisie true to the city's history. The loss of multi-ethnic Salonika, in his view, was also the loss of bourgeois Salonika. My book wrestles with such narratives of decline and fall. It asks, what became of Salonika's multi-ethnic commercial bourgeoisie as it transitioned from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek nation-state? How did merchants experience the passage from imperial to national rule? Integration presented a formidable challenge to Salonika's merchants. After the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, the Serbian and Bulgarian borders moved almost to its outskirts, and the city lost its extensive hinterland. To make matters worse, Salonika had become part of a country with numerous vibrant ports and no pressing need for yet another. Meanwhile, much as integration presented an enormous challenge to merchants, commerce was equally prominent in the minds of all those crafting a future for post-Ottoman Salonika. In 1914, for instance, there was a striking proposal to encircle the city with barbed wire and transform it into a massive tax-free warehouse. This and many other schemes had one thing in common. They fundamentally centered on commerce. The book then zooms in on merchants and places commerce back in the forefront of the passage from empire to nation state. To do so, I depart from three popular narratives. First, an identification of commerce with Jews. Second, framing Salonica's transition predominantly as a Jewish question, the integration of Jews into the Greek state. And third, equating the city's end-of-the-century bourgeoisie with affluent Jews. The nostalgic and celebratory discourse on Salonica's lost bourgeoisie has done much to revive the city's Jewish past. Ironically, however, it has also produced silences of its own. Now, surprisingly, the greatest among these silences concerns the Greeks, and Greek merchants in particular. Today, the history of Salonica's Greeks has largely faded into oblivion, more so even than that of its Jews. I attribute this paradox, for it is a paradox, to the fact that by casting the annexation of Salonika as liberation, Greek national discourse effectively denied the city's Greeks their own history. Their Greekness was assumed to be straightforward, and their identification with the Greek state and its authorities was taken for granted. As a result, the passage from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek nation-state was perceived as a simple return to the national body, a simple coming home of sorts. By contrast, I unearthed the lost history of Salonika's Greek merchants, charting the crooked line of their passage to the Greek nation-state. Their path, I argue, was not isolated, but deeply intertwined with that of their Jewish peers. The relationship between the two groups was far more complex than just a story of mounting animosity. In the early years of transition, Greek merchants agonized about Jewish migration, fearing its devastating impact on the local economy. Some among them, although fiercely patriotic, went as far as to propose the internationalization of Salonika, much like their Jewish peers did. The Greek and Jewish experiences of transition were both different and similar, diverging, but oftentimes converging too. In many ways, their stories were mutually constitutive. Consequently, this book is more than a comparative history of ethno-religious communities. It is a relational history of encounters and exchanges between these two groups, the Jews and the Greeks. This focus on relations serves a double analytical imperative. First, to construe transitions anew as a shared journey, and second, to account for the radical realignment in power relations between Greek and Jewish merchants. For these reasons, the emphasis is squarely on Jews and Greeks, with minimum attention paid to Bulgarians, Muslims, and Donme. But in the Q&A, I can further explain why this is so. So how can we then think of Jews and Greeks together? In the late Ottoman period, Jews formed the backbone of Salonika's commercial bourgeoisie. They were a majority, dominated all lucrative sectors of commerce, and set the tone of its public life. Greeks, in contrast, lagged far behind, lacking the Jews' economic, social, and cultural capital. In 1912, the advent of Greek rule alarmed the Jewish entrepreneurs, convinced as they were that a commercial nation like the Greeks would render them redundant. Indeed, Greece's annexation of Salonika set off a gradual but decisive shift, eventually reversing the ethnic hierarchy in the local economy. By the time the Second World War erupted, the landscape of commerce in Salonika had transformed beyond recognition. The once anticipated, I quote, Greek commercial conquest of Salonika, unquote, was complete, and the city's commercial bourgeoisie was now indisputably Greek. But how exactly had this shift happened? Existing historiography has often echoed the initial fears of Jewish merchants, pointing to the Greek state's policies of promoting Greek entrepreneurship over Jews. However, such accounts tend to paint a picture of a community, a Jewish community, under siege, depriving Jews of their agency. Moreover, these accounts often oversimplify the interactions between Jewish and Greek merchants, sometimes interpreting them merely as indicators of rising anti-Semitism. As a result, the making of a Greek Salonica is presented as a violent process, occurring at the expense of the city and without its involvement. Instead, I opt to take a closer look at local developments. I chart the changing power dynamics between Greek and Jewish merchants. I follow these merchants as they adjust their business strategies, come together in professional associations, engage in joint initiatives, interact with the lower middle and working classes, and seek a new modus vivendi. Jews, to a significant extent, sought to adapt to the new economic and social environment. Even though they ended up playing second fiddle, for Jewish merchants, becoming a minority was not about experiencing exclusion and marginalization. Rather, it was about negotiating a new relationship with the new majority, a relationship that was admittedly unequal, yet inclusive enough. Provocatively put, Jews became a minority of their own making. So next to the concept of minority, I further reevaluate the concept of majority by attending to Greek merchants. What makes a majority, and how did Greeks become one? Most studies of Salonica highlight the dramatic change after the 1923 Greco-Turkish population exchange, which brought 100,000 Greek Orthodox refugees from Asia Minor to Salonica, making the Greeks a staggering 80% of Salonica's population almost overnight. These analyses rely on external political factors, that is the Greek state, to explain shifts in local power relations. My book, by contrast, emphasizes the local agency of both Jewish and Greek merchants. The onset of Greek rule, I argue, did bring about numerous state policies, from commercial legislation to higher tariffs. These, however, promoted Hellenization not in spite of the widespread reactions, protests, and even demonstrations in the city they sparked, but precisely because of them. The Greek merchants, that is, of Salonica, though numerically small and economically modest, found themselves in a position to capitalize. They took the lead in the city's public sphere and fostered a new urban identity, that of the wronged, quote, indeed victimized Salonican, an identity so effective that was to be embraced by a much broader range of groups, from blue and white collar workers to Jews. To give you just an example, the local Greek and Jewish press described Salonica, I quote, as a colony of Athens, detecting a conscious attempt by the central government to, quote, paralyze Salonican commerce, and claiming that Salonicans were treated like Mamelukes and Kafirs. Ultimately, I contend, to be a majority is to act and speak like one. It involves not just enforcing one's will, but being capable of organizing interethnic relations and speaking for the universal interests of the city. Salonica's transition from Ottoman to Greek rule is the story of its Greek merchants moving away from their marginal place in the Ottoman city to becoming a majority by embodying the pan-Salonican rather than the exclusively Greek. Greco-Jewish relations were therefore not broken, but reconfigured. If that was the case, then we must also rethink what it was exactly that came before. As I argue in the first part of my book, what preceded the transformation of the 1910s was a distinctly multi-ethnic and Jewish late Ottoman Salonica. Not either of the two, but both. This dual character of the city was widely acknowledged by contemporaries, who noted Salonica's dizzying ethnic diversity alongside an unmissable Jewish prominence. However, what still eludes us is the relationship between these two aspects. How could Salonica be multi-ethnic and Jewish at the same time? How important were Jews in fostering multi-ethnic sociability? And to what extent was multi-ethnicity a precondition for establishing Jewish dominance, for creating the image of a Jewish Salonica? I offer an answer to these questions by arguing that in the final Ottoman decades, Jews figured as model citizens and exemplary Salonicans. Their philanthropy and sociability transcended communal boundaries. In doing so, they linked Jewishness to Salonica. Perhaps the best illustration of this merging is the life of Maurice Alatini, the most prominent Jewish merchant cum industrialist of the period. Alatini was a member of the Greek Educational Society of Salonica, contributed to the city's Italian colony, and generously donated to all communities, not just the Jewish one. These benefactions earned him the title of the Father of Salonica, and upon his death in 1882, his funeral procession united dignitaries and crowds from every community. Alatini's trans-ethnic philanthropy, like that of other Jewish benefactors, elevated Jewish merchants to the status of exemplary citizens and made Salonica central to their ethno-religious identity. The late Ottoman Jewish commercial bourgeoisie displayed therefore a majority mentality, claiming to represent the entire city and speaking in its name. As I believe it has by now become apparent, ethnicity alone cannot fully encapsulate the passage of Salonica's Jews and Greeks from empire to nation-state. Prominent merchants like Alatini were also communal notables and civic men, navigating and sharing multiple worlds. Class mattered. Thus, I depart from historiography's near-exclusive emphasis on ethnicity and delve instead into changes in the merchant's class identity during the late Ottoman and early Greek periods. The transition from a Jewish-led to a Greek-led commercial bourgeoisie was not just ethnic, but also entailed a significant class shift. The late Ottoman Jewish and multi-ethnic bourgeoisie of Salonica, I argue, had a class identity markedly different from that of its Greek successor. For Jewish merchants, transition to Greek rule was experienced not only as a shift in ethnic dynamics, but equally as a transformation of their class identity. Now, much of the literature on the Eastern Mediterranean port cities has romanticized the late Ottoman bourgeoisies as cosmopolitans par excellence. They have been celebrated as exemplars of multi-ethnic coexistence and admired for their ability to transcend boundaries and forge mixed, even hybrid identities. Promoted as counterexamples to the monistic identities which sectarianism, nationalism, and the centralizing state had subsequently imposed in the region, their post-imperial trajectory is for that reason often viewed as a rapid decline, both of themselves and the cities they helped prosper. Consequently, their perceived loss has been grieved accordingly. Nationalist contemporaries had once derided these commercial bourgeoisies as Levantines and rootless cosmopolitans. Today, we praise them for the very same reasons. Additionally, researchers of Ottoman port city bourgeoisies tend to treat bourgeois formation and bourgeois identity uniformly across different ethno-religious groups. Hence, becoming bourgeois among Jews, Greek Orthodox, and other ethno-religious communities is frequently portrayed as unfolding in similar ways, as a creative embracement of Western mores and social practices. However, there is enough historical evidence to suggest that Europe was not the sole bourgeois model to be appreciated and followed. David Angel, for example, a Jewish reformist teacher in Izmir around 1900, condemned the moral laxity, aloofness, and laziness of Izmir's Jews by noting how, I quote, how little they had borrowed from their Greek co-citizens, unquote. His observation underscores how certain ethnic groups, in this case the Greeks, were seen as exemplars of bourgeois values, generating anxieties among others and fears that they were being left behind. Now, understandably, there was no straightforwardly Jewish or Greek way of being bourgeois. However, becoming bourgeois is a historically specific process, shaped by forces that impacted each ethno-religious group differently. I therefore identify two different ways of becoming bourgeois in late Ottoman Salonica. Migration from the Ottoman Macedonian interior was crucial in forming a Greek commercial bourgeoisie, whose economic, social, and cultural outlook was strongly influenced by their regional origins. A plethora of local associations determined their mode of socializing. By 1911, there were at least 6 local associations in Salonica, all headed by merchants. Their fundraising activities fostered a sense of local patriotism. Locality and its performance or enactment in the city thus made them both Greek and bourgeois. Importantly, these local associations were a uniquely Greek feature, as there were no local Jewish equivalents. By contrast, Jewish merchant bourgeois identity was shaped by very different factors, mainly involvement in the community affairs and, for the wealthy Jews of Italian origin, like Alatini, the so-called Italian Jews or Francos, participation in Salonica's Italian colony. By the turn of the century, the president of the Italian colony was a local Italian Jew, Jacob Modiano. In addition, members of prominent Italian Jewish families held positions in all major Italian associations. Chevalier Charles Alatini led the Italian Beneficent Society. Chevalier Morpurgo headed the local branch of the cultural association Dante Alighieri. Dr. Modiano was president of the Italian Red Cross, and Edmond Mizrahi of the nationalist Italian Naval League. Model bourgeois comportment rested on service to the Jewish community, as well as a strong Western orientation that made Jewish merchants the most recognizably European bourgeois group in Salonica. So Greeks and Jews might have been both involved into bourgeois institutions and social practices such as the voluntary associations. However, these associations and the practices they fostered were of a very different kind, and thus granted their bourgeois identities with very distinct meanings. There were therefore a Greek and a Jewish way to be bourgeois in Salonica. What then, I ask, was the relationship between commerce and bourgeois identity, if any at all? Now, Salonica, like other Eastern Mediterranean port cities like Izmir and Alexandria and Trieste and Beirut, was foremost a major commercial hub, and hence merchants formed its core professional group. However, being a merchant was so much more than a mere profession. In Ladino, for example, the term mercader, merchant, often denoted a communal notable, the notable, and the two terms were frequently used interchangeably. Such noble attributions were not fixed but subject to contestation. In the course of the First World War, for example, Jewish and Greek newspapers alike often portrayed merchants negatively as ruthless, unpatriotic profiteers. They likened them, I quote, to vampires and leeches who sucked the blood of the poor people sacrificing their lives on the battlefront, unquote. Yet, by 1918, the same local press would laud those merchants as exemplary Salonicans who had saved the city from Athenian neglect. The term merchant was therefore a key symbol, a powerful metaphor that provided a language to speak about modernity, community, nation, and the city time and again. the merchants' economic, social, and political weight positioned them at the core of Salonica's bourgeoisie. In the late Ottoman period, commercial clubs stood as some of the most recognized and respected associations, and entrepreneurs like Alatini were heralded as major philanthropists. Yet, we have to go beyond numbers to understand what exactly made the merchants bourgeois, and conversely, how significant commerce was in the formation of a broader bourgeois identity. To answer these questions, I looked at the merchants' associational world, exploring how new practices of sociability, such as the club, linked commerce to core bourgeois values. I noticed that there were few exclusively professional merchant associations. By contrast, commercial clubs were magnets for some of Salonica's most distinguished non-merchants, state officials, lawyers, and doctors. Their broad appeal reflected a widespread positive valuation of commerce. Commerce was heralded, I quote, as the nucleus of the nation's prosperity, and its growth was applauded as, quote, the best omen for the security and well-being of the country, unquote. That is the Ottoman Empire. Commerce, it seems, was a status marker, and thus prominent merchants enjoyed a privileged status both within Salonica's bourgeoisie and the broader city. In short, Salonica's bourgeoisie was a commercial bourgeoisie for reasons going far beyond the merchants' occupational predominance. What became then of this commercial bourgeoisie once Salonica became Greek? Histories of post-Ottoman bourgeoisies remain scarce. The dominant narrative typically speaks of decline, often lamenting their economic downfall, loss of multi-ethnic character, and diminished local power in the wake of an expanding, centralizing state. It thus tends to overlook the agency of these groups. By contrast, I have aimed to trace how the passage from empire to nation-state affected the merchant's bourgeois identity. I therefore examined what it meant to be a bourgeois merchant in this new context. Interestingly, I found the advent of Greek rule came with a swift introduction of Greek legislation on associations, leading to their mushrooming. More than 120 were established by 1922, most of them now professional and organized by and for the labor and lower middle classes. Additionally, the impact of the First World War and the challenges in food provisioning heightened social tensions in Salonica, pitting the merchants against both the blue and the white-collar workers, and for that reason I call the relevant chapter the Great Class War. In this new context, the establishment of the Commercial Association in 1916 made a difference. Unlike the commercial club, which receded, it was a tool for organizing and articulating competing class interests. Similarly, the discourse of war profiteering now spoke of classes in conflict. As the Greek newspaper Tophos observed in 1919, I quote, "The two opposing social camps debate who is responsible for the unjustifiably high cost of living. Letters of merchants and compradors blame workers and their high wages. Letters of workers, by contrast, blame the greedy merchants. Between these two classes, there is not a conflict of interests anymore, but an implacable hatred," unquote. So these developments in associational culture and public rhetoric, I argue, reshaped how commerce was understood and how merchants in turn reimagined themselves as a class. For Salonica's merchants, therefore, the transition from Ottoman to Greek rule signified more than incorporation into the Greek nation-state. It marked their entry into a radically new society of classes. So a central argument of the book is that the transition of Salonica from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek nation-state involved not just a shift in the ethnic identity of its merchants, but also a profound transformation of their class identity. The merchants of Greek Salonica were a group distinct from their Ottoman predecessors, not only because ethnic hierarchies had been reversed, but also because their class self-perception was fundamentally altered. Hellenization and the remaking of their class outlook occurred concurrently, making their interplay a key focus of my study. This is therefore a story fundamentally about the trajectory of two ethno-religious groups, the Jews and the Greeks, as they made the passage from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek nation-state. Yet, it is equally a story about an occupation, the merchants, and a class, a commercial bourgeoisie, and finally about an urban community, the Salonicans. All three forms of attachment, ethnicity, class, and locality, underwent profound changes during the first decade of Greek rule, fundamentally altering what it meant to be a Jewish or Greek Salonican merchant before and after the 1910s. These processes unfolded in parallel, each, however, with its unique dynamics and pace. While, for example, ethnic tensions intensified in the final years of the Ottoman Empire, they paradoxically subsided during the Balkan Wars and the First World War, when class relations in turn became more strained. Moreover, once under Greek rule, the strong sense of Greekness characterizing Greek merchants was actually predicated on a self-victimizing perception of Salonika as being intentionally neglected by the central Athenian state. The more Greek Salonicans were turning, the more Salonican they were becoming. Local and national identities morphed together. Consequently, my emphasis is on the ebbs and flows of the period, resulting in a narrative that is less straightforward and more crooked than might be expected. In other words, the unmaking of a Jewish and the making of a Greek bourgeoisie was not just a matter of ethnic change. It also depended on reimagining the merchants as a class and the articulation of a new local discourse. Transition, I argue, is as much about class and locality as it is about ethnicity and nationhood. It affects majorities and minorities, occupational groups and social classes alike, reshaping ethnic, class, and urban self-perceptions in tandem. Hellenization was much more expansive than simply making Jews or the city Greek, and encompassed a broader range of actors beyond Jews and the Greek state. This is the big argument the book makes. So, as I have tried to show, Salonika's merchants are a compelling example for discussing transitions as transformations of identity. But in many ways, it is as good an example as any. What unfolds in the book's pages is a story that is representative rather than exceptional. Now, Salonika is often celebrated as a unique city, one like no other. Nonetheless, the evolution of its multi-ethnic commercial bourgeoisie exemplifies a broader yet understudied phenomenon that unfolded across the Eastern Mediterranean and East Central Europe as these regions made the passage from the Ottoman, Habsburg, German, and Russian empires to their successor states and mandates. Little is known about the post-imperial bourgeoisies of Jewish cities like Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Trieste, Alexandria, Istanbul, Lodz, Krakow, or Warsaw. Narratives of decline predominate, and research tends to emphasize minorities while overlooking majorities, examining them in isolation and disregarding interethnic relations. Consequently, we still lack a comprehensive understanding of how these once powerful groups handled the transition to nation-states. In short, the questions remain. How did they remake themselves? Now that the study of imperial bourgeoisies has affirmed their importance, it is perhaps time to revisit the history of post-imperial bourgeoisies too. Now, this might be easier said than done. What kind of narrative might do justice to such rich and complex histories? I'm tempted to say I have no clue. But Sarah Stein's constant encouragement to humanize my writing prompted me to experiment by employing 3 distinct narrative techniques. First, there is the main account, organized into 7 chapters. Each chapter aims at deconstructing Salonica's merchants, showing in turn the workings of class, ethnicity, and locality among both Jews and Greeks. But second, there are the 3 extensive vignettes or prosopographies that introduce each of the 3 parts of the book. These are my narrative attempts to present the merchants as concrete subjects. The long portraits of Jacob Cazès, Abraham and David Herrera, and Joseph Mizrahi are not mere illustrations intended to animate the narrative, although I very much hope they will do so. But you would have to ask Sarah about that. These portraits mainly aspire to capture the merchants' diverse array of activities as a lived experience, as a whole, rather than a sum of parts. They are intentionally sketches, which means incomplete. They aspire to capture complex individual trajectories in times of change, even though I know how irreducible to narrative these kaleidoscopic lives were. But next to these portraits, the illustrations inserted offer a third, final narrative, this time of merchants self-fashioning and refashioning. Put one next to the other, these images of eye-catching commercial letterheads offer a glimpse at the visual culture of a world in full motion. Much like the main text and the portraits, they document the merchant's passage from the Ottoman Empire to the Greek nation-state, but they present it while capturing all its arresting beauty. Enjoy, and thank you very, very much.
So we have about 40 minutes. I'm going to try to be a little bit concise so that we can open the conversation with the general public. First of all, Paris, I want to start by thanking you for researching and writing this book. As somebody who's interested in the question of minoritization and the ebb and flow of how groups expand and move around, or they're moved around by states in general, this is really an eye-opening book for me. I really enjoyed reading it, and I learned so much from it. But I want to start by asking a few questions about the strength of this book, why this book is really important, and what it made it important as far as I'm concerned. Which is, I'm going to start with the question of archives. You mentioned in your talk, and you talk a lot about this in the book, that this book is unique because of how many resources and archives you visited. And it's really incredible. You took me back to the French tradition of the last 19th century, when people were going around. And so one of the things that you do, I want to ask you a question about whether you think, because you're looking at this process of minoritization as far as these two groups, do you think that by moving away from central archives, at a moment where you know that nationalization tries to flatten these groups, how do you think these archives that you looked at bring up this unique process that you are trying to highlight in the book?
Thank you, Aomar. This is an excellent question. Let me be a little bit autobiographical here. When I started back in the Pleistocene era, researching about the book, I was a couch potato. I hated archives. I had stomachache if I had to go and visit one of the local archives. I mean, it was extreme. I'm a theory guy. It was extremely painful to me. But then the more, once I started going and researching in the archives, I developed what Caroline Steedman calls, archive fever. It almost proved impossible to distance myself. So why was that so? Because I started my research, and most of my research, although it took me to very many great places. I researched the Alliance archives in Paris, the National Archives, consular reports, therefore, in London, material in New York and elsewhere. I found out that there was an incredible wealth of information in the local archives. And the illustrations in the book are also a way to visually honor the material that can be found locally in the city itself. And I think there is also kind of an ethical dimension in it, in rediscovering, that is, the history of the city in the city itself, rather than dispersed around the world. And these archives are not your staple, conventional Jewish archives. The archives of the Jewish community of Salonica were lost during the devastating fire of 1917, and therefore, for the period that interested me, I had no access to this material. But Jews sprang anywhere and everywhere in the local archives I researched. And this spoke to me precisely because years ago, in my undergraduate studies, in my sophomore year, I was fascinated with women's and gender history. And one of the key kind of arguments of my teacher back then, and then supervisor, Efi Avdela, was that once you start looking, you can find women everywhere. Because that was one of the main questions of early women's history. Where are the sources to research women, if everything is written by men? And the same holds true, actually, for minorized, silenced groups like the Jews. And to me, this was a sign, an indication of the integration of the Jews into the life of the city. It was impossible for Salonica to operate with its Jews left out, but also the enormous richness of local archives in exploring relations rather than communal identities. And therefore, implicitly, I think, the question of archives that you so eloquently put also made me rethink the process of minoritization. Because these local archives, and I conclude with that, and these are archives mainly of local associations and the local press, they highlight so visibly the agency of those people and the way they worked together in order to promote their interests. And so, to my surprise, I found myself, when writing these long kind of prosopographies or vignettes, being able to almost follow the life of Yaakov Kazes, for example, almost month by month. And that made me aware how prominent a figure he was in the community, the city, the local economy, the local politics, and beyond, but also how interrelated and entwined these separate fields were actually, and how the one informed the other in making their lives so wholesome.
Okay. Thank you. So building on that, one of the as far as I'm concerned, again, one of the points that I really enjoyed in the book is this theoretical clarity.
No.
It's very clear, and the terminology that you use, and it shows because you from in the introduction and later on as you expand in the three cases that you introduce each section with, that you have certain terms that merchant, you talk about locals, you talk about what mutually constitutive, that these are significantly important terms that are, I think, coming from an economic history, but also you build on those to connect them to a social history. So my question has to do with the design of the book. And do you think that, what do you think you lost in your historical narrative by centering these figures, which I think that they're relational. They're local, but they're really relational. They do situate that narrative arc and tell us the story in a detailed way. What do you think is lost as far as the bottom-up society and as far as?
I think one thing that is lost is the state and the role of the state. Reconceived, rethought. There is very little about the Ottoman state and the way it operated locally, the way it interacted with the local public, the way state and civil society were mutually kind of conceived in modernizing the city and in making it bourgeois. And that is primarily because I don't speak Ottoman. I mean, I speak and read Greek, English, Italian, French, and read Ladino, which might seem impressive, but your average 10-year-old shoe shiner in the early 1900s Salonica spoke another 3 or 4 languages. So, I'm a really very small shrimp compared to the shoe shiner. But because I couldn't speak, I couldn't read Ottoman, and I was not trained as an Ottomanist, I had great difficulty integrating, and therefore I didn't, the role of the Ottoman state and the relations between those merchants and the state into my narrative. So that is one of the areas that are somehow, lacking in the narrative. The second, I think, has to do with the rather low emphasis on tension. There is, but I'm trying to move away from a discussion about anti-Semitism and ethnic tensions as such. They are in the narrative, but in a kind of a lesser way. And then there is obviously, if we talk about relational histories and the social history of social classes, there is less emphasis, one might argue, and quite a few reviewers of the book have actually pointed this out, on the working class. And we know how celebrated the Salonican working class is, and how prominent the role of Jewish socialists like Avraham Ben Aroya and the Socialist Federation was. But by focusing on merchants rather than on capitalists, for example, on industrialists, you actually move away from this kind of standard Marxist class politics and emphasize, and this is what I try to do, relations between merchants and white-collar workers, the commercial employees. So it is there, but in a kind of a less prominent way than perhaps I would have hoped.
But I actually like that, because in the introduction, and you come back to it at some moments in the middle of the book, where you make it clear, this is what I'm doing, and actually that intellectual and academic humility, that's what I want to do, and that really makes it clear, and I really enjoy that. But the reason why I am asking this question, because because there must be, you've seen a lot of stuff in the archives, in these private archives sometimes, that as you move away from these centers, that show that you can talk about this and you opt not to because you made it about these categories, the merchant and all that you want to. Yeah.
Okay, gender is one.
Okay. Yeah.
The way male, in particular, Jewish and Greek identities are constructed is totally missing from the book, and this is a major gap. All the more so because women as well, of those major bourgeois families, were extremely important in fashioning cultures of sociability, promoting philanthropy, but also in many ways I found shaping the transition to the Greek state through their own work, primarily in the realm of philanthropy, humanitarian aid, vis-a-vis the refugees, and so on and so forth. So women were not absent, actually, but quite instrumental, quite vital in shaping inter-ethnic relations between Greeks and Jews. They were very nodal in this respect. They are, unfortunately, not highlighted to that extent. The second has to do, and this might come as a surprise, has to do with names.
Wow.
Because Yaakov Kazes, for example, his name appears in 10 archives in 10 different forms.
Wow. Okay.
There is a Jewish form, there is a French form, there is a Greek form.
Interesting.
There is, and this changes over the course of time. So even deciding as simple a matter as how would you call him becomes a matter of choice that has consequences.
Yeah.
And I tried to navigate this by opting for the way they fashioned themselves, they presented themselves in their commercial correspondence, wherever I could find it. And therefore foreground their identity as merchants. But it tells you, I think, how impossibly kaleidoscopic their lives were, and so how difficult it is to pin them down. Yeah. They are even more active than my 7-year-old son. They cannot stand still. They cannot sit still.
So before I have one more question, then we're going to open the for. So the key concept, one of the key concepts that you talk about is minoritization. Can you discussed it a little bit in the presentation, but I thought it's probably one of the most powerful definitions that I've read in many books about minorities in the Middle East and North Africa recently. The way you really explain the book as a whole really showcase it, but can you talk a little bit about it as a concept that you use?
Sure. So what struck me to begin with is that, and I'll answer your questions, is how Jews in the late Ottoman Salonica, but also other ethnic groups in, say, the Greeks in Izmir, perhaps, and in Alexandria, they fashioned and adopted a so-called majority mentality. They didn't think of themselves as a marginal group. And so for the Jews, for example, that was very clear in the way they embraced Salonica as an integral part of their identity. And they were viewed by others as such. So minority, therefore, becomes then a concept or a term you can actually use to describe and label certain types of behavior rather than demographically small groups. And so the Greek Orthodox Christians of late Ottoman Salonica displayed a minority mentality, for example, precisely because they didn't engage so systematically with multi-ethnic sociability. They had their own Masonic lodges, their own associations, their own sports clubs, and therefore they were, in this way, subaltern, let me put it like that. Minoritization, then, for me, became a useful term in order to, move away from an understanding, from the staple understanding of minorities, which is a legal term to begin with. It is an external term. It is ascribed to a group. It comes with certain legal requirements, and therefore is very hard, and it's an extremely rigid term. You are this thing. Minoritization emphasizes the processes, and therefore brings the subjects in some way back in. Now, I'm not arguing that Jews willingly embraced this identity. They resisted it, but they also strategized with it. And they found ways, therefore, to carve a space for themselves by moving beyond ethnicity, for example, and siding with the dominant political party, or by embracing the victimizing identity of the wronged Salonica. Yeah. And in this way, they attempted to actively engage with a state that was in the process of nationalizing its population. Okay, this was not an empire anymore. But at the same time, it could tolerate difference of a certain kind and of a certain sort. And so minoritization is, I think, a term with its obvious limitations, but a term that also gives some agency to those populations that are impacted by this process.
Okay. Questions? Yes?
So Jewish merchants clearly thrived under the Ottoman Empire. And when Salonica became Greek, putting aside the issue of anti-Semitism, did the Greek merchants exploit suspicion, distrust of the loyalty of the Jewish merchants to improve their position vis-a-vis the Jewish merchants, which had been dominant?
That's a very good question. Not as intentionally as I would think and imagine. In fact, the greatest tension between Greek and Jewish merchants can actually be detected in the late Ottoman period, in the so-called Second Constitutional period, after the Young Turk Revolution, where there was intense animosity between the two groups, and a great anxiety that each group was actually engineering the destruction of the other through economic means. And this reflects also the discourse of the day, this kind of social Darwinism of the survival of the fittest through economic domination. And so you have, for example, the Greek press in 1910, 1909, 1911, before that is the Balkan Wars, actually demonizing the Jewish merchant as the most menacing and threatening figure, and the Jewish press also advocating for a Jewish economic domination in order to secure the livelihoods and the well-being of the community. After 1912, you do not see this as clearly and intentionally, at least among the local merchants. Why is that so? I think because both Greek and Jewish merchants faced similar kind of problems of integration. This was a much smaller market. They had to compete with the Athenian merchants who were much closer to the central governance. The Jewish entrepreneurs were central to the well-functioning of the local economy. And plus, the very rapid emergence of the trade union movement and working class agitation, and the very rough way that Greek legislation was impacting the conduct of business, actually produced common enemies, so to speak, which is the working class, 1914, 1915, late 1910s, waves of strikes impacting both Greek and Jewish merchants, as well as the Athenian state, which proved to be detrimental, or was understood to be detrimental to the local economy. So I think, plus, the Jews were an extremely powerful group. And so they didn't suffer from this kind of vindictive policy of the Greek state the way, for example, Jewish socialists like Benaroya suffered. They were the first to be expelled, they were the first to be imprisoned, they were the first against whom the notion of the figure of the unpatriotic, anti-Greek Jew was actually stamped upon. But the Jewish merchants, not so. And so, capital in its many forms actually mattered in this respect.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for sharing your book and your research with us. You mentioned, in terms of the archives, the Great Fire of 1917, which affected, which was a huge blow to a large Jewish residential and commercial quarter. Obviously, not the properties, the factories, the portside facilities, but what is the role of that event in your narrative of the rebalancing between the two mercantile classes in terms of bourgeoisie class? I haven't really put that into your fascinating story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's another, coming back to your question, that's another kind of gap in the story. I wished I had more time and more pages to research the impact of the fire. So the fire of 1917 decimated, the Great Fire, so to speak, of 1917, decimated the entire downtown Salonica, completely erasing it. Commerce was disrupted, for sure. All the major stores were burned to the ground. The old commercial district, the so-called Quarter of the Franks, was saved, wasn't impacted. And so the blow was immense. But catastrophes are also opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so the new plan allowed those with capital to invest in real estate property and to invest in modernizing the city. And most of those who held capital were actually the Jews. All the more so because they had prospered for one last time during the First World War by essentially monopolizing the procurement of a 200,000 strong Anglo-French army that was encamped in Salonica. And for that reason, the fire itself offered them one more way, and one final way, to assert their place in the city. On the other hand, they were also financially strained. And so who would benefit from the rebuilding of Salonica? Athenian realtors and entrepreneurs, like Epaminondas Charilaos, for example. And thus, this created a panic in the city, that the Athenians are taking over our very own homeland, so to speak. And that, for that reason, was severely experienced by the Jewish merchants as well as the Greeks. And for many, it signaled the end of an era, and therefore the intensification of emigration to France, Italy primarily, and later on, much later on, the United States. So it's a complex, it had a complex kind of effect, both positive and negative, depending on where you look at and the cases you unearth in the archives.
Thank you so much.
Yes, Sarah.
Thanks, Paris, for a wonderful presentation on top of a wonderful book, and glad to welcome you to the big fish, the big pond. I was wondering if you could reflect on the shifting use of language in the letterheads and what it teaches you about self-presentation. I'm thinking about when does Ottoman disappear, when does Medina disappear, what, you know, and so on and so forth. I think everything we've seen is early enough that those languages are all represented, but surely they must slowly be removed. And I wonder what that how it might support or feed into your arguments about moments of chronological shift.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I mean, there is an Achmias up there, by the way.
Yeah.
I think what those letterheads tell us is, I mean, they tell us a lot of things, but to me at least, they're visually extremely compelling. I mean, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
They're really beautiful and very elaborate. And they become less elaborate in the interwar period. I mean, even, you know, the Ottoman calligraphy has an aesthetic element into it. It's, and so that, I think, points to the multilingualism, but also how integrated the market was in the late Ottoman period. That much we know. What we know less, and this concerns primarily the Greeks, is how linguistically fluid their self-fashioning was. There was the Greek line, but there was also the Ottoman Turkish translation line, the Bulgarian or the Serbian, and certainly the French. And so this kind of, you know, multilingual cosmopolitanism also reflected how strategic their patriotism or sense of Greekness was. They would speak and act as Greeks in their social practices, but less so in the market. Now, as time goes on, there is a change, of course. And this, the last letterhead comes, I think, from 1927. Okay? This is the Alvo brothers Singaleri. What you notice here is the modernity of the new shop, the writing in Greek, but also the writing in Hebrew. So one of the arguments I make is that Jewish identities also change, and they become perhaps less kind of cosmopolitan and European. There is no French in the writing. It's just Jewish and Greek. And so what you see here is the emergence of a Greco-Jewish identity, hence the question of minoritization, right? The fashioning that is visually of this kind of a double identity, of a highly legitimate way of being both a good Greek and a good Jew. And so letterheads, I think, point to this moment of transition, but at the same time to the rethinking or revisualizing of a Jewish identity, if I may say so. What disappears, of course, is the Serbian or the Bulgarian, the French more and more so. And so you move from a cosmopolitan world of multilingualism to a more national world of majorities and minorities. Let me put it like that.
Yeah. Yes.
I just wondered, was there much intermarriage between the Jewish community and the other communities? And I ask partly because it's sort of the counterfactual here, which is, well, this could have gone another way, and it could have, when you're making an alliance, including a business alliance, intermarriage is quite a good strategy. So maybe you could talk about that, comment on that in some way.
Yeah,
great.
that's a very good question. There was very little intermarriage, and any kind of affairs were actually cause for scandal and treated as such, as an incursion into the crossing lines. And what we have is few, but progressively more collaborations, business partnerships between Jews and Greeks. One of them, the most important, was between the Olympus Brewery, which was a Jewish company, and the Nausa Brewery, which was Greek. Nausa was much smaller, but the two merged in late 1910s to face Athenian competition and survive in the national market. And so that was one of the strategies that the Jews in particular followed in order to survive and thrive in an increasingly Hellenized and national market. In the course of the interwar period, there were more of this kind. The interesting thing is that the Greeks, despite investing less capital, they were always on the top of the board. And again, this is one probably strategic decision of accepting a kind of a minor position despite the much more, the stronger economic capital one would invest. But yeah, very few intermarriages, very, very few. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Maurice. My question is not unlike Sarah's. I'm thinking about also the use of language and whether the contracts themselves, you're finding any indications of also contracts written in Latino that would suggest that maybe the networks were not completely overlapping, that the Jewish merchants were also taking advantage of connections through religion, extended family, similarities, cultural similarities, that maybe the Greek merchants didn't have access to?
That's a very good question. Thanks, Sharon. Indeed, networks matter, although we have very few business histories that would allow us to trace and reconstruct this kind of networks. I think the old kind of paradigm or argument of business history that ethnicity determined networks, particularly after the work of Francesca Trivelato, is open to much criticism. So some work I did, there is a bit in the book, there is more in an article on networks borderline illicit during the First World War actually point to interconnections between Jews in particular, Muslims and Donmen, with Central Europe. And so Central Europe is also an area that looms large in commercial geographies, imagined geographies, and much less so due to the predominance of the Alliance in historiography itself. So the Jewish networks more generally were much more expansive, much more global, much more international, and that spanning the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and even beyond. And that gave them tremendous power, precisely because they could also tap on financial resources like Jewish banks in Central Europe. The Greeks didn't have this kind of extended networks. their networks and trade was much more regional, so Macedonian, and that's one of the arguments the book makes, also determined alongside other factors their regional identity outlook, and so the prominence of a Macedonian identity over a purely Salonican one. And that is one of the reasons, these kind of extended networks, why the Greeks panicked so much once Salonica became Greek, because they fully realized how crucial the Jews were for the functioning of the city, to their own advantage as well.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So how much do we know about descendants of these merchants?
We know a few things. We don't have, as far as I can tell, concrete and complete genealogies.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of myth making, from kind of a rags to riches story. But what we know points, I think, to two things. A, that most of the Greek merchants came from the Salonican hinterland, small villages, and then they moved, or towns, and moved into the city. Mm-hmm. Some of them, like the entrepreneurs from Nausa, the industrialists from Nausa, were much stronger there than in the city itself, so a city close to Salonica. What I think we can also tell is that, and this is more of an educated guess, that these kind of long genealogies of Jewish commercial prominence might not always be the case. And so many Jewish merchants came from humble backgrounds and rose to prominence in the 1870s and 80s precisely because of the advent of global capitalism in the Ottoman Empire and the integration of the city of Salonica in the global economy. The second thing we know is that at least initially, quite a few of them were apprentices into Greek Orthodox businesses. And this practice kind of ceased in the 1870s with the advent of modern education, where you could be trained as a merchant in the school rather than on the spot as an apprentice. And so this kind of separated the two communities. But it is true that we lack this kind of extensive and extended genealogies. We lack the sources to a great extent, the business records, the letters, the registries that would allow us to reconstruct these kinship networks and understand how they work.
Thank you. Well, I think it's time. Wow. 3:30. Thank you so much, Paris. It's really a joy. Please,
thank you very
the
much.
book is there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a
Very
great
good.
presentation.
Excellent.